Okay, we're going to be playing some jazz today. I'm trying really hard not to say jazz in that kind of fast show voice. It's nearly impossible. And this video is actually a follow-up video to a couple of jazz lessons I did recently, and I've not planned it this way, but this is turning into a bit of a beginner's jazz course, and I'm covering all of the things that I consider to be most important when you first start to get into this style. And in the previous videos I looked at essential beginner jazz chord voicings, and we took a look at the jazz standard Autumn Leaves and explored the theory and the harmony and the melody of that tune. In this video we're going to be getting into soloing and improvisation, which is really what jazz is all about, and we're going to be taking those chord changes from Autumn Leaves and looking at some different approaches to improvising over them. So I'm going to be assuming a little bit of prior knowledge in this video. If you're not familiar with Autumn Leaves, then you might like to check out that previous video. I'll put a link to that up on screen now. One of the reasons Autumn Leaves is such a popular beginner jazz tune is clearly it's a classic jazz tune that's been played by nearly all of the greats, but it's quite an approachable one in terms of the harmony and theory. Essentially this tune is just in one key throughout. There's no crazy modulations or unusual chord changes or anything like that, so it's a good one to get started on. And as far as starting with improvising, there are lots of different approaches to this, but perhaps the easiest one for a beginner is just to think in terms of the melody. We've already learned the melody, so you could actually start by basing your solo off of the melody and using that note choice, maybe embellishing the melody, changing the rhythm or mixing it up a little bit, and you can get a perfectly acceptable solo in that way. And then beyond that, I think you've got two main approaches when it comes to improvisation. You've got key center playing, and then you've got what's known as playing the chord changes. So with key center playing, you just ask yourself, what key are we in here? Find an appropriate scale, and then away you go. You can just use your ear to find nice lines and melodies, and that can work pretty well. But then if you want to take things a bit further, then you can look a bit deeper at the harmony of the tune and describe the individual chords as they go by with chord tones, which means using triads or arpeggios to really describe the harmony. And these approaches aren't mutually exclusive. If I'm taking a solo, usually I'm going to be mixing several or all of these approaches. So sometimes I'm just thinking melodically and using my ear, other times I'm thinking in terms of the key center and using scales, and the rest of the time I might be describing the chords using arpeggios. And perhaps the easiest approach is the key center approach, particularly with a tune like Autumn Leaves, because the whole tune is in the key of E minor or G major, which is really the same thing. So you could just take an E minor scale or a G major scale and it will more or less work over the entire tune. So you could give that a go, sort of put on a record or a backing track, play along to it, just use the E minor scale, G major scale, and see if you can find melodies that fit just using your ear. It's a really good exercise, and I might just try and demonstrate that right now. And in fact, you could just use the E minor pentatonic scale to play over the entire tune. So why don't I try and put together a little solo. I'm just going to play E minor pentatonic up here at the 12th fret. Just going to restrict myself to that scale. I might throw in the flat fifth to make it the blues scale occasionally, but with a little bit of commitment, a bit of style, you can actually make that sound okay. Actually sounds okay and surprisingly good, I think. And obviously you wouldn't want to overdo this kind of thing or it will get quite boring quite quickly. And in a real solo I'm not going to just use the E minor pentatonic scale. So beyond this approach you're going to want to get into playing those chord changes, describing the harmony, and this is where it really starts to sound like jazz. And this kind of thing takes a lot of practice, a lot of time to get fluent with. So I'm just going to spend the rest of this video giving you a few easy ways to get started. Arpeggios are really the key when it comes to playing chord changes, and they're really just going to give you the good notes. So what we're going to be doing is playing arpeggios over the autumn leaves chord changes. When the chord changes in the tune, you're going to change your arpeggio, and this is really hard to do. And ultimately, I suppose there's no substitute for just putting the time in and learning those arpeggios. So you want to know your major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, minor 7 flat 5 arpeggios in the caged 5 caged positions in all 12 keys. And it takes ages and it's a bit tedious, but it does pay off, because then you're going to have these materials under your fingers, you're going to have the sound of these things in your ears, and that will enable you to play over this chord progression and over much more complex chord progressions. And if you need some help with those basic arpeggios, I have done a series of 4 videos looking at each of the main arpeggio types using the caged system, so that will give you a starting point with all of that stuff. Then it will be over to you to actually put the time in and do the practice. But even if you're not already super fluent with all those arpeggios all over the fretboard, doesn't mean you can't make a start playing jazz. I think it's sometimes easy with jazz to get overwhelmed and it just seems too complex. There are too many options. So in this video we're just going to do things in one way, in one area of the fretboard, just as a way of getting started. So what I want to do is work on arpeggios in this bit of the fretboard, so the 7th position. This is a area of the fretboard that works well for the key of G and the key of E minor. So I'm thinking about my G chord shape here, or my E minor chord shape here, and you've got your scales here, so G major, or E minor, which is the same thing, different starting point. Your pentatonic scales as well, your blues scales. So that's giving you all of your key center stuff, but of course within those scales you've got all of the chords, all of the arpeggios that belong to the key. Those notes are already built into the full major or minor scales, so we're just picking those notes out of the scale to outline the chords in this tune. And the first exercise that I'd recommend you do is just drill those arpeggios up and down through the chord changes to autumn leaves. So doing it quite freely, so we're not doing this in time. You're just spending as much time as you want on each arpeggio before moving on to the next one. It's a good way of getting these things under your fingers. So if you remember with autumn leaves, it's based on 2-5-1 progressions. So we kick off with a major 2-5-1. So A minor 7, D7, G major 7, and we're going to outline those chords with some arpeggio. So if we're doing it in this position here, the way I like to do it is to start on the lowest available root note. So we've got an A root note here, and we're going to play an A minor 7 arpeggio. So you need the notes A, C, E and G. It's a simple A minor 7 arpeggio, but I'm going to try and play all of the available A, C's, E's and G's in this position. So I'm going to go up as far as this high C. That's my highest available note in this zone of the fretboard. I can come down all the way to this low C, and then I like to come back up and finish on the root note, so I'm hearing it as A minor 7. So that's the drill. So that's our A minor 7. Then we move on to the next arpeggio. So we've got D7. So we have a D here, a D7, we need a D, F sharp, A and C, and we can carry on into the next octave. This is our highest note, and then we can come down and finish on the root note. That's our 5 chord. Next we need G major 7. Here's a G, and the notes we need G, B, D and F sharp. Just expanding that to all of the available notes in that position. Next we've got 4 4 chord C major 7, and we can start here. So C major 7. Then we're moving to the relative minor key, if you remember, and we've got these chords. So F sharp minor 7 flat 5, B7, and then E minor 7. So for the F sharp minor 7 flat 5, there's our F sharp root note. We need F sharp, A, C, and E. Go as far as this high C and then descend. It's our lowest note, and back to the root, then B7, and then E minor 7, which is the 1 in our minor 2-5-1. And that's really it. As you know, the entire tune really just repeats. It's just a combination of the major 2-5-1 and the minor 2-5-1. So that would be the exercise, just drilling those arpeggios up and down, following the Autumn Leaves chord progression, but not worrying about timing there, just spending as much time as you need on each of those arpeggios before you move on to the next one. Next exercise would be to do a similar thing, but now thinking about playing in time with the tune. And one of the problems with arpeggios is, particularly with these arpeggios that are covering all of the options, there are lots of notes there, and if the tune is going by quite quickly, there's no way you're going to have time to play all of those notes. So we need to restrict our options a little bit further, I think. So a good idea might be just to work with 4-note arpeggios rather than playing them in all these notes in different octaves, and that way you stand a chance of actually playing these notes in time to the tune. So that's the next exercise. We're just going to play 4 notes of the arpeggio over each chord change in time with the track. So it doesn't particularly matter which octave you play these arpeggios in, you can experiment with that, but I'm going to play my A minor 7 like this, and then D7, G major 7, C major 7, and then we've got the minor 2-5-1, F half diminished, B7, and E minor 7. That's the first section of the tune, the A section. That then repeats. We've got a B section which starts with the minor 2-5-1, and it goes major again, then minor, then we've got this section of the tune where there's this pair of 2-5s. So here the chords are changing a little bit more quickly. It's harder again with this to get all of those arpeggio notes in. So what I'm going to do there is just play, so E minor 7, and I'm going to go down 1 fret to hit this C sharp, which is the 3rd of the next chord. I'm not going to play the entire arpeggio on that chord. When you're actually soloing, you don't have to play all of the notes in all of the arpeggios. Of course you don't have to do that. So here I'm just going to go, which is really a classic bit of jazz language for navigating a 2-5-1. You just go up the minor 7th arpeggio, the 2, and then down 1 fret, and you hit the 3rd of the 5. So it's a really nice little move, very useful. And then I can do the same thing here over the D minor 7 to G7, and here I am just going to dip out of position, so I'm going to play this lick here and then just play the same thing down 2 frets, and then the tune wraps up with another minor 2-5-1. So that's the exercise, and I do want to stress this is just an exercise. We're not playing jazz yet, but it's a really good way of getting these notes under your fingers and starting to hear these chord changes. So what I'm going to do is just play that exercise in time with the track, and you can hear how this works. I've just got a little backing track here taken from the I real book. It's a little bit cheesy using these kind of backing tracks, I realise, but I think it sounds okay for practice purposes. Obviously that's an exercise, and it does sound at the moment very exercisey, but you can quite easily go from that exercise towards something more musical, and various ways you can manipulate these arpeggios. So another exercise might be to reverse the order of the notes in these arpeggios. So rather than going up the arpeggio, we could come down. So here I'm starting on the flat 7 of the A minor 7 and coming down, and you could go through the chord progression like that. So I won't go through the whole thing in this video, but I will write that exercise out in my tab. And then from there, we can try and make this a little bit more musical. And the obvious way of doing that would be to introduce a little bit of rhythm and to make the order of the notes a little bit less predictable. You don't always have to go straight up or straight down. You don't always have to start on the root note. You don't always have to start on beat 1. You can mix up the rhythms, mix up the order of the notes, and that starts sounding a little bit more like jazz. So I was just mixing up the order of the notes a little bit there, adding some rest. You can repeat notes as well. So nothing wrong with just repeating notes like that, and it gets away from that arpeggio sound. You don't always want to sound like you're doing an exercise going straight up and down a scale or an arpeggio. And another really key skill to develop here is smoothly changing between these arpeggios. So what you don't want is so you're resetting on the root note every time. It sounds very clunky like that. That's absolutely fine to do that as an exercise, but to make nice melodies, you're really going to want to connect smoothly to the nearest note. That's a really good thing to work on. So if you're going up the A minor 7 arpeggio, for example, you can connect down 1 fret to the closest note in our D7 arpeggios. This is what I talked about in that earlier example. So going up to the flat 7, and then we hit the nearest note in the next arpeggio. From there you can go down or you can go up. So whenever you're coming to a chord change, try and be thinking ahead. What's the chord that's coming up and where is the nearest note in that chord? You can go up to the nearest note or down to the nearest note, and that way you get a smoother sound, smoother sounding melodies. So bearing all that stuff in mind, I'm going to try and put together a more authentically jazz sounding solo. So I'm still going to restrict myself to this zone of the fretboard. I'm going to restrict myself mainly to notes in these arpeggios. I might embellish a little bit, so you can use these arpeggios as a starting point, and then throw in some passing notes, some chromatic notes, and some scale connections between these arpeggios. But these arpeggios are going to be the basis of my solo, and I'm going to try and keep it beginner friendly. I don't make these videos to show off and impress people, so I'm just going to stick to this zone of the fretboard, play a nice beginner friendly jazz solo that's going to show you how you can take these simple arpeggios and turn it into music. So there we go. I think that's an okay-ish jazz solo, and I'm just using these simple materials. I'm not using substitutions, I'm not using modes of the melodic minor or any of that stuff. It's just arpeggios, maybe with a few chromatics and things thrown in, a little bit of rhythm, and it starts to sound like jazz. So it might take a little while before you arrive at the stage where you can play that kind of thing, but if you work through these exercises, if you get to know your arpeggios, this is certainly something that's achievable. And once you've got to grips with this exercise, obviously you could expand it in various different ways. I think the first thing to do might be to do exactly the same thing but in the other areas of the neck. So if you're thinking in terms of cage, you've got 4 remaining zones in which to play around with, so you can do the same exercises there. So a lot of work. Don't get overwhelmed with that. Just do it in one place to start with, and then when you're feeling confident you can move on to the other positions. And the good thing about it is once you've done it really thoroughly in one position, the same arpeggio shapes will recur, and it kind of feels a bit easier once you start moving on to the other positions if you've really done the work in one position to start with. And that's it for this video. Hope you found it interesting, hope you found it useful. As usual, tab and a backing track are going to be up on the Patreon page, and what I'm going to do is write out a full tab workbook to accompany this video. There's going to be a lot of information in that. I'm going to write out all of the examples that I've played, so check that out if you're interested. And I think I will follow up this video with some more jazz stuff, so an obvious thing to do next would be to perhaps look at another beginner friendly jazz standard. Let me know if you've got any suggestions there, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.